Good evening, good evening, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Spilling Tea. I'm your host, Tiffany Daniels, and we're going back to that horrible world known as the JRC and then some. But before we get started, the usual disclaimers. You're going to see the link to the article we're going to be covering for the next couple of days right there in the description box, alongside the other pertinent links to the Stop the Shocks campaign, including Autistic Hoya's massive archive on the subject and the template. You know the drill. Sign your name, click on your senator. This is extremely pertinent right now, guys. So we've got a lot coming up right now. This is getting ready to go out onto the floor in the Massachusetts Senate coming up this May. Get your voices heard. We also include the phone numbers in the templates to these senators as well. Bug their offices. I want Massachusetts to know they are being watched, and they cannot continue to get away with allowing this shit to go on without knowing the world is watching them. All right? Okay, we also have the ever-present and self-explanatory change.org Shut the Judge Rotenberg Center Down petition. Excuse me, I just did my stairs and allergies. This is why I want to lick the coal. Folks, when we talk about the JRC, you're going to hear vivid descriptions of and catch clips of surveillance footage of peoples with disabilities being tortured and abused. If you got young children present, please use your headphones. And always, it's afternoon. I work a call center. My brain is in brain dead mode. So if I stumble over my words this evening, my apologies in advance. Okay. So this is kind of a long-winded named article here. And it's going to be interesting because this is more about than just the JRC. A lot of the practices that they use, although not to the extremes that they use them, are used in public schools throughout the country. Yes, unfortunately, even still here in Missouri. And yes, you must know, me and the allies out here are still fighting. So, let's get into it. Unexpected Spaces of Confinement, Aversive Technologies, Intellectual Disability, and the Bare Life by D.L. Adams from the University of Toledo, USA, and Nirmala Avelis, the University of Alabama, USA. Okay, so this is the abstract part here. Giorgio Agamben describes the camp as the zone of indistinction between law and violence, where bodies located in exceptional spaces are stripped of citizenship rights and embody bare life. We deploy Agamben's analysis to the context of the everyday violence of aversive technologies meted out against students living at the dangerous intersections of race, class, gender, and disability, and located in unexpected spaces of confinement such as schools, developmental centers, and family homes. Oh, damn. Do go on. Because, folks, I've worked in this field a long, long time. And a lot of the reasons why, let's just put it this way. Minority, poor communities are preyed upon by people like the JRC. And states, for whatever reason, perhaps it's cheaper for them, would rather send them to hellholes like the JRC instead of putting in the money and the time to create resources in these communities that parents can have access to for their kids, that are peer-reviewed, tested, and have been being used for the last 30 years with a large success rate. Why, in 2022, are we still sending kids to places like the JRC instead of putting time and money in these communities to develop the resources and put into place the programs that we already know work. That's what I would like to see. We argue here that the logic of state of exception applies to disabled children and adults, where acts of violence enacted via disciplinary practices are justified as being outside the realm of the legal and subject to via disciplinary practice to surveying power. The focus of our study is the Judge Rotenberg Center, that over the past 40 years has utilized behavioral techniques that have been investigated as abusive and only very recently has been held accountable for these infractions. Barely. Fucking barely. They've had to pay settlements. But they continue to get away with it because they keep being protected. Why are we protecting these people who prey on minority communities, bring these students in, and torture them? Someone explain this shit to me. We examined discourses used to justify these forms of inhumane punishment, as well as the discourses that oppose them to foreground the real material implications of how we understand the role of systems and institutions of punishment in unexpected spaces of confinement, children, and adults with disabilities. And of course, we use the keywords. But we're going to read the whole thing. It's so scary you don't even feel like it's real life anymore. You just feel like you're floating. I would just try to make myself float because it's so scary. I would ask God to make my heart stop because I don't want to live when that was happening to me. I just wanted to die and make it stop. Jennifer Masumba. And that's why I'll never fucking stop until every goddamn person in that building is safe and will never, ever have to face that kind of inhumanity again. Introduction. The above epigraph is transcription from a 2014 interview on CBS Evening News when Jennifer Masumba, a biracial autistic survivor of the Justice Rotenberg Educational Center. Hey, you want to know what brave and stunning looks like? That would be Jennifer Masumba. Take fucking notes. Henceforth referred to as the JRC, where she lived from 2002 to 2009. Her testimony was given at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, henceforth referred to as the FDA, advisory panel hearing to support a proposed ban on electric shock devices used in behavioral modification therapies for children and adults diagnosed with intellectual disabilities, mental illness, and or autism. Again, cookie cutter approach at its worst. At its worst. Think about it. They already used a cookie cutter approach for autistic kids in most systems. Like out here in Missouri, finally, after years, I'd say within the last decade, we started to get slowly out of that mentality. But this place used a cookie cutter approach for every single disability. Makes no sense. You would want to cater the treatment to the diagnosis, wouldn't you? Because otherwise, you're just punishing someone for existing. Then on the 24th of April 2016, the FDA moved to ban the electrical stimulation devices, ESDs, and other aversive techniques used to treat aggressive or self-injurious behaviors in response to testimony given by several residents of the JRC and disability rights activists. Although it did take till fucking 2020 to finally get them to actually fully act on it, and then we all know what happened in June of 2021. Recognizing that these devices present an unreasonable and substantial risk of illness already in the distribution and use. Of illness or injury, the FDA is proposing to include in this ban both devices and devices already in distribution and use. God help us. But this is not a done deal. The FDA has presently opened up the issue for public comment, and there are several powerful constituencies, including some parents who are vehemently opposed to this ban, Brown 2015. Gunnerman 2007, Kicks 2008. These people are from the old school or have been educated by the old school, where they believe that the ends justifies the means. They drink the JRC Kool-Aid, and they truly believe that this is the only way that this will help the kids. These ways do not help kids, okay? Creating robots, creating people who are completely controlled by fear is not helping anyone. But trying to convince people of that for the last fucking 14 years, folks, we're fucking tired. We've had some people in this since fucking 1976. Imagine how tired they are. We, however, are troubled by the frequency which disabled children and adults, especially those with intellectual disabilities, experience physical and mental abuse and even death at the hands of not only agents of the state, police, teachers, nursing home employees, but also individual citizens, parents, children, personal caregivers. We read that during the Disability Day of Mourning. By the complacency with which the public regards these forms of punishment and murder as both normative and necessary. Boom. When you consider punishing someone for existing as necessary because we make you fucking uncomfortable, maybe it's not us that has the problem. When we are not willing to put money into kids who live in certain communities or have a certain skin color, but would rather send them off to these hellholes and not give the parents the resources necessary and access to them in their own fucking communities, programs that have been peer reviewed and have worked for decades and have gotten results time and time again. Yes, folks, even in those that are considered worst of the worst, I'm just saying there's a massive problem, a huge problem. But let me go on here. Even more troubling is the realization that these adversive technologies are not only located in prisons, but also in the unexpected spaces of confinement, rehabilitation centers, nursing homes, and even schools. An oft-repeated adage that presumably adheres to the principles of fairness states that the punishment should always fit the crime. What if one's only crime is being black, disabled, queer, and or transgendered? For example, over the last few years we have witnessed the murder of African Americans by the police as well as other vigilantes in the U.S. because of their being black. The spectacle of black suffering has become so commonplace that critical race scholars describe the violence against black lives as mundane rather than exceptional. Hartman and Witterson 2003, Neal 2016, and Neely 2008. We argue, however, that while we respond with horrified outrage to black suffering transformed into mundane, we also recognize that in the mundane lies the exceptional. In this paper, we point out the exceptionally that among the many murdered, beaten up, and incarcerated bodies are also bodies diagnosed with mental illness and or intellectual impairments, whose lives or deaths are barely registered except in the small and often marginalized communities in which they are cared for and cherished. Refusing their erasure obscured by mundane, this paper begins as a dedication that remembers and reminds us all that the violent implications of the punitive structures and practices that have marked their lives and their deaths. My brothers and sisters. We explain this exceptionality and the violence of the mundane by applying Giorgio Agamben's 1998 notion of the state of exception to the discourses used to justify the violence meted out against the disabled bodies located in the unexpected spaces of confinement. In his book, Home, Caesar, and Bear Life, Agamben 1998 describes the camp, the zone of indistinction between law and violence, where bodies located in exceptional spaces, the state of exception, were stripped of citizenship rights and social privileges because they were believed to embody bare life. We go back to the creator of fucking ABA who likes to say, with an autistic person, you have the makings of a human. You have nose, ears, mouth, legs, arms, but you're not really people. Yeah. Here we deploy Agamemnon's analysis and angry response to the everyday violence of adversive technologies utilized to discipline persons located in places of confinement such as schools, developmental centers, and family homes. We argue here that the logic of the state of exception applies to disabled children and adults diagnosed with mental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and autism, where violence is enacted via disciplinary practices by security personnel and even personal caregivers, teachers, teacher aides, parents. It is the intent of the foreground, the material, and the discursive implication of how we understand the role of systems and institutions of punishment in these unexpected spaces of confinement. The camp that Agamemnon refers to has usually been applied to prison-like settings, such as the concentration camp at Auschwitz or the detention camp at Guantanamo Bay. It is very rarely that non-institutional spaces such as nursing homes, rehabilitation, and educational centers and schools that serve disabled children and adults are conceived of as a camp. However, Chapman et al. 2014 emphasized the importance of thinking of spaces of confinement as broader than the prison and the asylum to also include spaces that confine disabled people against their will. Boom! In fact, these unexpected spaces of confinement are inspired by the same eugenic ideologies that sought to protect society from the social dangers of those who have historically been considered racially, physically, intellectually, and socially deviant. Fucking thank you. It is those same goddamn ideologies that are in play right now at the JRC and schools like it across the country. One specific focus here is on the unexpected spaces of confinement that use behavioral therapy punishment for the social control of those disabled bodies resistant to normative rehabilitative and educational interventions. Or so they say. How often do they say these kids got kicked out of all these schools, but every single one of those schools are ABA? How many of those parents say they tried everything, but you never see even once positive behavioral reinforcement, person-centered planning? Those are just the two off the top of my head. Because the language used to describe these therapies punishments are quote in discourses of care rather than crime. And both the adults and children who receive these cerebral punishments are diagnosed with intellectual impairments, mental illness, and the general public, as well as scholars working for the abolition of the prison industrial complex, have often failed to recognize that these spaces exist in a continuum ranging from prisons and jails to institutions for the intellectually disabled and at psychiatric hospitals. Thus, even though the focus of our discussion is a specific institutional setting, the JRC, our intent is to foreground that broader structural practices and their corresponding ideologies that proliferate both in those unexpected spaces of confinement as well as in the prison and in the institution. We first contextualize our argument by describing aversive techniques deployed in the JRC, the camp for care and treatment of children and adults diagnosed with mental illness, intellectual disabilities, and autism. Next, we briefly describe Agamemnon's 1998 conceptualization of the Homo saucer. Next, in order to explore the ways in which the state of exception applies in this particular context. Finally, we conclude by foregrounding the disclosures that justify how surveying acts of violence and modern technologies of biopower intersect and inform one another, such that they constitute disabled bodies as bare life. So this is going to be interesting, folks. This is going to go over more than just one subject. We're not just going to be talking about the JRC in this one. We're going to talk about the entire frame and form of thinking that leads to the type of quote-unquote treatments that exist at the JRC, as well as other institutions, group homes, and parental homes just like it. It's going to be interesting, both for me on a psychological level, to kind of understand, where does this concept come from? How did this logically even come about to be even thought of as treatment? Why is it that disabled kids, especially minority disabled kids who are preyed upon most especially by these schools, why is this logically condoned as treatment when the medical motto is do no harm? How can they not think of what's happening in these places as do no harm? And on that note, folks, I'm going to close out for tonight. We don't get very many views on this channel, and the few that we do tend to get removed from time to time. So, folks, please don't forget to hit that like button, hit subscribe, and don't forget to hit the comments. I do appreciate your time this evening, and as always, we here at Smelling Tea hope you have a good one. Bye-bye.